It was a normal day in France, and Flight 114 was getting ready to take off. All of the different dogs boarded the plane in the order of their designated seating. The poodles boarded first, with black clothing, white necklaces, and fluffy white fur. Their hair needed constant grooming to stay in the fancy status quo they had set for themselves. They sat in the first class, which offered full meals whenever they wanted and low airfare costs, and gave them a quiet place to pray together in solitude. Next, the well-groomed Labradoodles, boarded with their luxurious items, such as warm sweaters, feathery scarves, booties to keep their feet clean, and giant dog houses. They completely covered themselves with these items. They sat in business seating, which also offered full meals, low airfare costs, and seats where they could also talk business with the other dogs. Lastly came the mutts, with no more than the ragged clothes on their back, too poor to afford a seat in the higher class. They were also too poor to afford grooming, so they all had a knotted fur and dirt along their bodies. This seating didn't provide meals, and the airfare costs skyrocketed, which made it so they could not afford much else. The dog who took the most important seat in the entire plane was a giant Tibetan Mastiff, who went by the name King, and who would be in control during the flight. He was the biggest of all the dogs, yet he was weak as a mouse. So, he stood behind his title of pilot to establish power over the dogs on the plane. He was accompanied by his co-pilot, the Afghan Hound, who was very dependent of the Mastiff and how he helped supply her with whatever food and accessories she wanted to make herself look pretty throughout the flight. She liked to keep herself to a higher standard than anyone else on the plane, with crazy hairstyles that made her stand out. Most of the passengers didn't like her because of how she pushed any button she wanted to in the cockpit. Due to her pushing all these buttons, the turbulence only got worse. This wasn't just an ordinary flight, though. This was the first flight ever to fly across the entire country.
As the Mastiff reached cruising altitude, he made an announcement over the speaker that in an aircraft like this, there could be a possibility of turbulence. The business class and the first class didn't worry because their comfortable seats wouldn't affect them, but the dogs and coach became very skeptical. All of a sudden, the turbulence shook the whole plane, and it continued for an extended amount of time. All of the mutts screamed out in horror as they weren't able to strap into a seatbelt to protect them. Yet, in the front of the plane, the business class and the first class weren't bothered by the turbulence at all in their comfortable chairs. The inside of the cockpit was in chaos. The pilot was trying to fly the plane, and the way he was doing it was causing the passengers to go crazy. The co-pilot wasn't doing anything to help with the problem. She just continued to randomly press buttons, which caused more and more turbulence, and made the passengers even more unsteady. The mutts looked into the first class and the business class, and saw that the poodles and labradoodles were all fast asleep with food surrounding them. The mutts were furious with all of the poodles and labradoodles. They decided to take action and stand up for themselves. They needed to get their message across to the captain, so they needed to find the right place to make a stand. The mutts knew that the Bath Steel, where one husky brought people to torture when he wanted to, would be the best choice to start their stand. The mutts all gathered together and marched as a unit to the Bath Steel. They broke down the door so the husky was exposed. The mutts captured him and brought him to his knees. One mutt got a knife from the back of the plane, and in one swift swing, the husky's head was rolling on the floor. The mutts now had control of the Bastille, but what the Bastille stood for was a representation for what the mutts wanted to change, with the fact that a single husky abused his power of control for whatever he wanted. So the mutts destroyed it, inch by inch. Word of the destruction reached the cockpit, and the Mastiff was starting to understand that a movement was starting.
As the flight progressed, the turbulence continued. Even though the mutts were heard by the Mastiff, no changes were made. Then 1 hour, the Mastiff decided to shut the door between the business class and coach. The mutts got furious, but they weren't going down without a fight. so they decided to meet somewhere else. They went to the door to the coach flight attendant's office. Then one little chihuahua named Perry, who was the coach flight attendant, stopped serving his drinks to the coach passengers due to the absurd turbulence. It wasn't that he wasn't being affected by the turbulence too much, but he couldn't bear the sight of the coach dog suffering so much. So he stood up on a box after he put down his drinks and made a speech. He was such a small doggo, but his voice traveled across the entire coach. Attention all mutts. Aren't you tired of being inconvenienced by all this turbulence? He said in his scratchy yet loud voice. The mutt said, Yeah! Are you willing to make a change to create equality on this plane? Aw, yeah, the mutt said. Then stand with me and let me help you gain your rights. The mutts all joined in a howl. The brave Chihuahua led the pack of dogs to discuss with the first and second class to debate the rights of the mutts. This meeting was held in between the third and second classes' seatings, where the flight attendants met to talk. Eventually, the first and second class just locked the mutts out of the small room. In response, the third class met in the plane wing. Since the plane was so big, they had small storage rooms in the wings. This is where the third class gathered to discuss their plans and how they wanted the plane to be steered. This is also where the third class officially started calling themselves the International Assembly. They stated that all mutts will be equal, and they signed a contract saying all mutts would not rest until there was no more turbulence, and the mutts could have the same privileges as the other class.
Back in the cockpit, the Hound still didn't care about all the turbulence she was causing, and the pilot wasn't going to say anything because he was afraid of the reaction he would get. At this time in the flight, there was an announcement over the speaker. To all mutts, the cost of pretzels will now be raised from $1 to $4. This continued to anger the third class, and eventually they realized they needed to take action once and for all. The mutts all gathered once again and stormed through the business class, then the first class, and then to the door of the cockpit. The mutts broke down the door, and they wanted blood. This brought the attention of the air marshal, so he got up and tried to protect the pilot, but he was quickly overthrown by all of the mutts, and in the process, his head was cut off just like the husky. The mutts continued to the cockpit and saw the mastiff sitting in his seat with a look of terror in his face, but the co-pilot was nowhere to be seen. The mutts demanded to know where the Hound was. She found no hope in hiding, so she came out from the room in the corner of the cockpit. The mutts forced the Mastiff and the Hound to leave the cockpit, because they were done with the way that the Mastiff and Hound were flying the plane. For the moment, the Chihuahua took control of the plane, while the rest of the plane was getting adjusted to the recent pilot and co-pilot being kicked out of the cockpit.
Perry was getting comfortable in the cockpit, and he was very happy with his new position on the plane. Yet there was something in the back of his mind that thought all the dogs were going after him. He knew that keeping the Mastiff and Hound alive would change how the people viewed him, and he didn't want to ruin his credibility. So, he brought them both to the plane door, leading to the plane jet. You could jump out of the plane, and the jet would rip you to shreds. So he grabbed both the Mastiff and Hound and dragged them to the doorway. King's last words were, "If this will improve your flight, then I'm glad to..." Ah! Perry threw him at the door before he could finish his sentence, and he was torn to parts. Next was the co-pilot. She started to say, "Let them eat but she, too, was thrown out the door before she could finish her sentence. Perry heard someone saying the pretzels were not as good as they were before the turbulence. And the turbulence, speaking of which, was worse. Perry responded by grabbing this mutt and throwing him out the door too. All the mutts looked in horror, and then they started to growl, and they started to bite and bark at no other dog than Perry himself. Perry ran to the cockpit and locked the door behind himself. Perry made the decision to kill himself rather than become the victim of the mutts and be torn to shreds by the jet. So he took his tie and tied it to the ceiling. Standing on the controls of the plane, he stepped off the controls and started to choke. Perry nearly passed out before the dogs broke the door and leaped to rip the tie. They dragged his vegetabilized body down the aisle and threw him out to the jet as well.
After Perry was thrown into the jet engine, the plane once again reached a point where the dogs didn't know who was worthy of flying the plane for them. Then, all of a sudden, a schnauzer named Leon came out of nowhere. He kept praising himself on why he would be a great pilot. This new dog was too overconfident with himself and decided for himself to storm into the cockpit and put that pilot hat on, no matter how the people felt. He wanted to be in charge, so he put himself in charge. As soon as he had control of the cockpit, he instantly changed how the plane was moving. He didn't want other people to comment on his flying, so he shut the cockpit door and continued steering. He said on the intercom that things would go back to how they used to be. First, second, and third classes would all be restored, but the food and water on the plane would be much better. There would be educational videos playing on TVs throughout the plane, and the turbulence would persist but be less severe. So the plane kept flying and the dogs kept dogging, but eventually another dog would stand up and another would stand down, yet the plane will always fly.